It's a big, fat lie. They taught this to scare women and to make them think, once again, that they're being victims, and so that they're victims of men. And so feminists are the last people in the world you want to take any advice or information from about men specifically or marriage.
Today is a long-form interview, actually, with the lady I'm very glad to have on the show. She's made the rounds for a while, but she's had some articles recently at the Federalist and Washington Examiner that caught my eye. You can follow her on the Twitter at Suzanne Venker, SuzanneVenker.com. She's the author of the book Women Who Win at Love. But what really caught my eye recently was I want to make sure I get the title of this article right. Ladies, stop trying to have sex like men. Did I say Susan? Suzanne Venker, how are you?
Goodness.
I'm fine. No, you said Suzanne.
Okay, thank God. I made sure that I read it here. That's one of the rare instances where I go down to my notes because Suzanne, people have a thing about that, and rightfully so.
Well, I do get called Susan, and I don't usually respond, but this time I thought I'd correct you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And one time someone actually called me Stefan because some people spell it PH, and I said, well, hold on, not only am I not Stefan, I don't even spell it that way. So you made the error writing and then correcting. Turns out he was dyslexic as well. This was an actual guy at a comedy club who would introduce me.
Not his fault.
So, Suzanne, Miss Venker, really appreciate a lot of the content that you've put out there. And you were booked for this show before Alyssa Milano went on her sex strike, which we'll get to in a second. But
what a coincidence.
What a perfect layup. The article, Ladies, Stop Trying to Have Sex Like Men. For people, I want you to describe it for people, but let me kind of recap what I got from it. You deal with what you sort of presuppose as an intellectual fallacy in that women are as sexually predatory as men, which is kind of a tenet of modern feminism, or at least that's what a lot of feminists want to be. Correct me where I have that wrong, and why write about that at this point in time?
Yeah, huge reason to write about that. It's all changed, and not because people have changed, but because society and the culture has with respect to the messages and the narrative that is sent to modern women about sex, which is essentially part and parcel of the larger feminist message, which is that there are no differences between men and women, that whatever differences you think you see are just a social construct or the way that parents have, foolishly raised their children, and that to accept this means to understand that we need to upend society and do things very differently so that we can achieve so-called equality with men. And
the social construct, that's when women's studies became gender studies, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Because now, just recently, I think it was Alyssa Milano, actually. She was just apologizing because someone said, Alyssa, not all women have vaginas, some have penises. She was like, oh my gosh, if I could correct it, I'm sorry. So, I mean, that's got to be pretty tough even for the feminist women out there who would disagree with you.
Well, I've steered clear so far of that issue because that's taking it to like a whole nother level.
Right.
I'm still back on really the remnants of the 1960s feminist movement, which is still very much with us today. In fact, it's so with us, it's not even a movement. It's just embedded into society and accepted as a fait accompli. So the idea of equality, meaning sameness, has fully taken hold to the point where people don't appreciate or understand or just even grasp the vast differences between women and men and how they're meant to work together as a whole to complement. And so what we have right now are women effectively competing with men because they think they need to be more masculine to get this so-called equal world.
Right.
So the sex piece is very
I would like to focus on that if we may for a second, because a lot of people, and we've talked about this quite a bit with Karen Strawn and Cassie J about sort of the myth of the income inequality, the wage gap, things like that. But specifically sexually, I mean, we had Naomi Wolf on the show. She said, well, women like to have sex too. Well, that's not really the argument we're making. We're talking about a different, sort of intellectual and emotional interpretation, processing of the way men and women handle sexual encounters. At least that's what the argument that I'm making when I talk about this. Could you give us some specifics on that? How do men and women differ specifically when it comes to sex? And what do you think the biggest lie is that's been pushed regarding that?
So the biggest lie is exactly what you just said. The Naomi Wolf types will suggest that women are no different from men in this regard. And of course, they do come to the table with a completely different set of needs and expectations when it comes to that topic. Now, first of all, there's the physical reality that women's bodies are saturated in oxytocin, which is known among psychologists as the bonding hormone. And men do have oxytocin as well, but a much smaller amount. They're much more favored with testosterone, which is a different hormone altogether. Mm-hmm. And so you have the physiological differences between them. And what happens even with sexually liberal women who, and this is all coming out in the book this year, that I've co-authored with John Townsend, who's a professor who's been studying this for years. And the research shows that even very sexually liberal women who want to, who buy into the narrative of, sex is great, doesn't matter whether you're, in a relationship or not, just having it is what matters. They will enter with that mindset and then have sex and be very confused about why the next day they're still thinking about that person and that event in terms of its future capacity in a way that the man isn't necessarily doing, and not understanding why that is.
Well, to play devil's advocate, they would argue that that's sort of societal conditioning, right? That's guilt. Same thing as this idea of being abstinent. When I talked with Amy Schumer, I guess it ended up being a debate on Fox News 8-9 years ago, which didn't really age that well for her. That was the argument, that this is societal conditioning. Once women had the pill and once they were told that they no longer needed to be a byproduct of this conditioning, they could be as sexually promiscuous and predatory as men, because that's I guess a freedom that they wanted to enjoy.
And if there's anything that proves that to be utterly false, of course, it's the Me Too movement. Because why would we have, now when I talk about the Me Too movement, I don't mean the necessary takedown of certain powerful men who deserved a fall. I mean all the repercussions after that of the bad dates and how it went wrong. We wouldn't have that conversation, or that even the circumstances wouldn't even come up if women were really genuinely just like men, because that confusion wouldn't be there after the fact.
Right.
Like that Aziz Ansari case with...
I still don't fully understand that case. It seems to me that he liked to have a hand in his mouth, which just was weird. I don't even get some of these sexual proclivities. I don't even, I understand some things, but I'm like, what's attractive about that? In that same vein, no, it's a perfect example because this is the show you chose. You saw the ride, you bought a ticket anyway. There does seem to be really sort of, the premise itself is conflicted, kind of going to Alyssa Milano, this idea of a sex strike. From feminists. It assumes that withholding sex would disproportionately affect men, which wouldn't really matter if we both wanted sex equally. I mean, do you have any idea what my wife would do if I said, you know what, for that, now you get no sex for 2 weeks? She'd laugh her ass off and go to Costco.
We don't like to talk about this. It's a really unpopular topic to admit that women... Well, there's a sleep study recently done, I still have to write about it, where men and women were recently asked whether they would rather have sex or sleep these days with what's going on in the world today. And women, by and large, chose sleep over sex, whereas men didn't. So the idea that women, especially women with children and jobs and all of the rest... So
the solution is that for the man to have sex and the wife to be sleeping. This is what you're advocating, correct? I want to make sure I'm understanding this.
There's lots of ways to do that, I guess.
Okay, sorry.
But the point is, everywhere you look in every study, the differences are clear and they're there, but they're not popular, right? Because they go against the narrative that men and women are absolutely equal, or could be, if society would just get out of the way and let them show how equal they really can be. Or same, I shouldn't say equal, the same, because that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important, and I know that you recognize this, that people can have, or couples, husbands and wives can have equally important roles, but they're not the same. They are not equal in the sameness, but they're equally important.
So that's really the crux of understanding what's happened with feminism and how it's affected people today, is exactly what you just said. The whole premise of it was that you can't be considered quote unquote equal unless you're doing the same tasks. But that could only be believed by somebody who so clearly devalued the work of one of those two works, one of the two tasks, if you will. And of course, it's always been about motherhood. Let's face it, it's about taking care of kids in the house. Right. Because they diminished that role, the feminist mind has so little regard for that role. That's how they managed to get other people to also have that same view. Because if you don't happen to share that, you're not going to have any resentment because you believe so fully that what you're doing is of equal value, if not more, than holding a job.
Right.
So it's only people who are insecure about that that value, and then were told over and over via media in every possible way, whether it's the news media or television or movies or what have you, that this is the lesser than role, that said, well, yeah, that's not, I want to go do what's valued. And it's human nature to want to be valued for what you do. Women used to be valued for that role, but feminists took all that away by valuing the paycheck over the relationships and the connections and the home. And so that's what caused people to jump on board, because they wanted to be valued.
Right. Well, they would push back and say, well, we wanted to value the choice of a woman to choose a career versus motherhood, just as making it just as readily available as a man. So why push back against that? I know you know that some of the left, they've painted you as someone who's letting men off the hook and telling women that it's all their fault. So what negative effects, or would you have any data that you could point to, as far as this sort of sexual liberation, specifically as it relates to sex and gender roles and relationships? What ramifications have we seen?
Well, there's ramifications for sure, but real quickly, if it were true that it was just all about choice,
right,
then here you are 30, 40 years later, all the choices are right before you, right? Women can have anything they want in terms of their lives. And
even
with
penises
that,
now.
Even penises.
Hey.
And even with that, as Jordan Peterson has pointed out over and over, the countries with the most gender equality on paper, Sweden and Scandinavian countries, the more you have the opportunity for choice to do whatever, the more the opportunities there, the more likely you are to see those sex differences show up. Mm-hmm. So the whole feminist theory has been completely shattered some 40 years later by proving, in fact, that 70 cents on the dollar they think it proves discrimination, of course. In fact, 40 years later, if you have all that choice and you still have that disconnect in salary, that's clearly a choice, because you have the opportunity now and you're still choosing it. Right. So the idea that you would just choose it if you had the opportunity isn't holding up.
Does the same apply to sex, in that women have women have sex more freely available to them? I don't even know what frex is. They have sex more freely available, but they tend to try and stay within the confines of a more monogamous relationship?
So with respect to sex itself, it's so hard. We're still piecing through everything that's happening, really, because when you talk about this hookup culture, which is so awful, because women have been, there's a lot more reasons as to why they're engaging in this behavior, and it's only in part because it's not just in part, it's the whole enchilada, but there's different pieces to the whole concept of mapping out your life like a man's and being just like a man. Mm-hmm. If you're going to postpone marriage inevitably, 10 years out to where women used to do it, mm-hmm. and you're focused on the career, well, most people are going to want to have sex before they're 30. I know you were exception and you had that great, I love that article. That was great.
No, I wasn't 30. We got married when we were 24, and I talk about how, it was very difficult.
Well, I loved your article. I thought it was great. I'm sure it was very difficult. And more power to you. But most people, unless they marry younger like that, if you marry at 22, 23, 24, 25, much more doable, in my opinion, for the average person, at least as a sales point to sell it, than if you're going to wait till you're 32 or 33.
Right.
That's going to be a lot harder. So the abstinence idea works really well if you marry younger. But you can't really call for that and say, marry in your 30s. That's never going to fly, right? So, but that's the message women are getting, that you marry later. So, of course, what are you going to do in the meantime? You're going to have a lot of sex. You're going to have a lot of different relationships that you're going to move in and out of. And my argument is that that's ultimately very destructive, in my opinion, to specifically women, but I think men and women too, because I think a lot of men would like to find women who would like to get married and settle down. But now they're finding women are more aggressive than they are in the sex department.
Yeah.
That's another consequence of this narrative.
Yeah, we just had a letter about that in a life advice segment yesterday, where he was a virgin and she was not. She was previously married and she was into some stuff that he was uncomfortable with and he was asking for advice. I'm like, I haven't really run into this before, but my advice is don't take anything off the table because you don't know in 15 years if you might want that on the table. So talk it out. But what negative ramifications, I guess, would you point to specifically? So let's assume, okay, a woman has postponed marriage indefinitely and she's having sex with more partners than before the 1960s through today. Like, what if you were to make the case to a young woman? What would you say are the benefits to being abstinent, or at least keeping sex reserved for a serious long-term relationship?
Oh, gosh.
Sorry, I know these are very macro questions. Like, why would it be good to find someone you love? I know it's tough but I'm trying to give you enough lane to use.
Because I always open with the same question if I were talking to a young woman. What do you want? What is the end goal? That is such an important question, especially today, because I don't think we think far beyond tomorrow because of the way the world is today. You got to go for the long term and think about your life as a whole. What are you going for? And ultimately, you're going to find that most people want to say, even if they're not ready or think they're ready for marriage, they at least want to be in a long-term committed relationship with somebody who loves them and they love back, that they can count, in other words, a relationship as opposed to not a relationship. Right. Okay, well, here's how that works. There's a thing called dating. It used to be called courtship. Right. And that's called getting to know the person date by date by date by date until you're way in and the relationship has been established, you fall in love, and then invariably the bed will come into play there. Now, whether you do that before marriage or not, at this point, I'm just happy if people just wait until the relationship is very established, which is why in my upcoming book, I have a list of 8 dating rules, and one of them is don't have sex with him on the first, second, or 20th date. And when I've told this to the younger generation, millennials or younger, it's as if I've said, don't have sex before marriage. It's equivalent to that because the idea that you would wait 20 dates, and the 20 dates, the whole point of saying that is just, it's initial shock value, but the point is exactly what I just said. Right. The relationship, the bond comes first. The sex is inevitable once the bond is there, but you don't put the cart before the horse because invariably it's not going to work out long term. So,
well, what about people who say, what if you're sexually incompatible, that you bond beforehand, then you find out that you're not compatible sexually? That's a very common argument.
Yeah. So you might have a different take on this since you were abstinent before. So you'd have a better firsthand take on that, I suppose. But I always argue that I didn't say you have to necessarily wait until you're married, right? So if you want to determine that prior to marriage, right? Figure that out shortly before, right? Like once you're in. But I also happen to think that it's a very natural thing that you can. I think it's a weak argument.
It's not rocket science, typically speaking. Now, I would imagine more so for women in the sense that if they find a man who is attracted to typically angry, aggressive feminist types, he might be a selfish lover.
Yeah, well, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Why'd you get with him to begin with, right? But I think the sexual attraction chemistry comes way before. I don't know what I can say on this show.
No, you can say whatever you want. You can say honestly whatever you want. I said penis like 5 times. You can say it.
Before you put the penis in the vagina.
Whoa, not every woman has a vagina. That's the problem. It's not the words. It's the premise. I don't agree with it. Neither would Alyssa. But that's what I call Milano. Continue.
Before that happens, you already know whether you have chemistry. You don't need to do that specific thing to know the chemistry. You sit down across from somebody on a date, and you'll know like that whether or not you're attracted to each other. A few dates in, you're still going to know. I mean, you know, and presumably you're kissing and whatnot, and you can determine this sexual attraction without that specific act.
Right. That's a good point. And I want to make sure before the angry warriors come in. Like I said, my wife and I were completely abstinent for each other. And before that, I had done some stuff in high school. I had lived a full life. But that's why it was so hard for my wife and I, because we said, listen, we want to be consistent with our values. And was, of course, wildly sexually attracted to her. This idea that it's easy. I mean, it's not easy. It's certainly not easy for men. It's also not easy for women. That being said, it wasn't easy because we were in a loving, committed relationship. I think it would have been pretty easy for my wife, or she would tell you it was never a struggle to fend off one-night stands. That came pretty naturally to her. But
Right.
once we were in a relationship, it was a struggle for
Yes.
both of us.
Yes, it is. It's very hard. And so some people will make it and some people will not. But at this point, like I said, we're so far out of the gate on that. I'm just happy if people just associate sex with bond, commitment, relationship, and not entertainment.
Right.
I mean, that's really what I'm going for. That's what I'm interested in, especially for this younger generation. And I really think they don't understand the connection because they don't have anybody who's telling them to wait or to that comes later. They think that there's
there's kind of a split. There's kind of a split between the, I guess you would say, sort of the far left progressive feminists who just say have free sex, you have a birth control pill, put on a sailor's condom. Of course, at the taxpayer expense, they need to pay for all of these contraceptives and birth controls, including.
Of course, that's another subject.
Yes, exactly. 16 out of the 21 for Hobby Lobby is not enough. That's clearly oppression of women. We have not reached yet the stage of choice. I don't even remember what my point was. What was I talking about before this? I just started thinking about Hobby Lobby.
Where are you going?
I have no idea.
That you waited and it was hard and okay.
Careful, poor choice of words. But
Hey.
oh, this is going to be my point. You
Accurate.
wrote another article, I think it was a Washington Examiner, about the positive societal effects, and I've talked about this quite a bit. Listen, when you talk, what I was saying, the far progressive left. Let me get to that next point. Let me put that on the shelf. And then you have sort of the incels, the people on the right who have just, they've taken part in this sexodus because they're afraid of women. A lot of men, or they've been rejected by women. They feel they've been mistreated by women. But it's not necessarily voluntary. And then you have a lot of men who sort of reject this idea of long-term relationships, and that leads to the hookup culture. And there aren't many people saying, hey, listen, there's a place for complementary roles in relationships, and waiting is a good thing for both of you. A lot of people saying, well, hey, you know what? Women are now acting like whores, so now go out and be a cad. And I think that's an important point to make, and you write in your articles about the positive societal benefits there, including fewer fatherless households. I mean, we've talked about this in the show. Maybe you can educate them a little more than I would.
Sure.
Compared to free healthcare and education, the idea of a nuclear family would solve a lot more of society's woes.
So I would say that's probably really more at the core of why I do what I do and what my real ultimate message is. It's really about saving the family, but that's too lofty of a goal, so I have to break it down. But that's really ultimately what I'm talking about, because there's a direct connection between our new attitude towards sex and you have to take that and break it down to what's happened as a result of that. And so I connected it to fatherlessness, saying, so ultimately, the more you're embracing this idea that sex is not, forget marriage at this point, that it's not even connected to a bond in a relationship, is to essentially move away from any sort of courtship or marriage or dating rituals that would lead to marriage. And I'm saying, look, the goal for most people, don't ask feminists because they don't care, but for normal people, they want to get married and have families. That's a fact. In fact, 99% of people are going to do that. If you ask them, at least they want to do that. So what's the best way to get there? And so if you're relationship oriented and you're marriage oriented, every choice that you make sexually is going hopefully lead toward that.
Something just happened with your microphone there. I think you might need to
Darth Vader
rotate
just
your headphone jack or something. I apologize. You sound like, I don't know what's happening. What's going on there? Maybe unplug it and plug it back in.
Now?
Like Daft Punk.
Let me hear you. Keep giving me yes, that's better. You started sounding like Daft Punk there for a second. No, sorry. Continue with the point you were making about it obviously being important to preserve marriages.
If your goal is marriage, then the decisions that you make early on are all predicated on that goal. Mm-hmm. So, and that includes sex, and in terms of, everything, what you choose to study in school, and certainly the kind of guys or gals you're going to go out with is going to be dependent on what your ultimate goal is. So since most people want to get married, I'm saying then make a connection between the choices that you're making early on, as opposed to thinking that you're going to worry about that later. And so if you're postponing marriage and you're moving in and out of relationships and just having sex more casually, then clearly that has something to do with why fewer marriages are being formed to begin with. Because by the time, and here's the kicker, by the time women get into their 30s, their mate value, declines, whereas men's rise. Now, nobody wants to talk about this, and this is going to be in my book, but men, as they get older, become more attractive because they're getting more established in their careers and in their lives, and it takes men longer to mature than women. Yeah. So by the time their mate value rises when they get older. But as women get older, especially in their 30s, those men the same age are often looking for younger women. More fertile women, more attractive women.
They become like silver foxes, sort of like Timothy Oliphant. I mean, I'm a straight man, but I see him with the silver hair, and I say, as I see the grays coming in, well, I'm just going for the Timothy Oliphant look. If some guys really pull it off, not that women become physically less attractive in their 30s. That's not what I'm suggesting. But, men tend to be a little more awkward a little later in life.
Right. And as they get more established, they become more attractive. The research is there. It's not me, that's how it's always been. And it's still that way. And even with this so-called equal world that we live in, women still look for men who are stable and who they can know that they can count on should they choose to bow out of the workforce down the road, which, by the way, most do. That's another big farce that feminists sell about the number of mothers.
What is the percentage of women who drop out of the workforce?
So right now, like what you'll hear in the media is 70% of mothers with children under 18 are in the workforce. And that's technically true. What they don't tell you is that the vast majority of that group work part-time. So if you combine the mothers who work part-time with the mothers who don't work at all, which is about a quarter of mothers, married mothers now, we're talking about married mothers, of course.
Okay.
Then you get the majority of married mothers who are actually home full-time or home full-time and have part-time work on the side, which could mean, anything as little as 5 hours a week.
Right. It could be an Etsy shop where you sell some seaweed soap.
Yep.
By the way, shout out to my Etsy lady who sells seaweed soap. It's wonderful.
Sure it is.
It is. I support Etsy. I support the little guy because I'm not the party of big business or small business. I'm the party of Etsy storefronts that I would never walk into if they were physical storefronts for fear of my own personal safety.
And that's a perfect example of businesses. You would lump that person in who has a business. Maybe she opened up a shop after her kids were all in school, and she works during the hours that her kids are in school. You cannot lump that person in with a mother of 3 children under 5 who's in the workforce full-time, year-round. You just can't do that.
No, you can't.
Those are two totally different lives.
And it's also not fair to compare that career arc to say, Dr. Ben Carson, who was separated and conjoined twins at that time. It's like one takes a little bit more commitment and means that he probably needs a woman who can help support that role because it's a very high-pressure, high-time value scenario.
But then that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning about devaluing that non-remunerated work. So work that does not, if you don't have accolades and a paycheck, it's completely dismissed in this country. It didn't used to be that way before feminism came along to do that to it. I mean, we exalted mothers.
That's a good point. I look at it sort of as almost planning for life after college. It is kind of crazy when you think about how much time we spend thinking and planning and, of course, instilling in children that, well, it's very important to pick your major. It's very important to figure out what you want to do in life. But something that will affect more people. I mean, most kids change their majors, but most people will want to get married, and particularly women. We don't spend nearly as much time telling them to plan for that portion of their life, which will be more fulfilling and more impactful.
I do, but I think it's extremely rare. I mean, I don't know of anybody who really goes out and tells them one-on-one, look, here's the deal. Don't listen to this. Don't listen to this media. Basically, my overall message is, if you listen to the culture and follow its narrative, you will fail in life and in love. You will fail because everything that they teach you is going to land you in this, it's a dead-end road. And it's because they won't talk about these truths, these politically incorrect truths about, for example, the difference between women and men and how they want different things, how they bring different things to the table. Here's a perfect example. In the last week, there's been 2 articles about the number of, the amount of work that married mothers have to do on the home front compared to their single mom counterparts. And since single moms don't have to do, the reason single moms don't have to do as much work as married moms is because of that dreaded father/husband who's in the house who causes more work for her. So then they hailed single motherhood as, well, it's not so bad after all. In the end, actually, it's really great because A, B, C, D. Right. With, of course, no conversation about the children.
I'm assuming they didn't poll the kids in that Rachel from Friends episode.
Exactly. No conversation about the children.
Yeah, no, so, I think, and I will say this, and I don't see you at all as letting men off the hook or this idea that you're I see you as truly looking at the idea of choice and wanting to value all work provided from both men and women. But I will say this, a lot of these lies from modern feminists, they do seem to instill a false sense of confidence or value in certain choices for women. For example, if you get a career, you will be fulfilled. And I will say that as a general rule, in my experience, they instill fear in a lot of young men. And I'll say I had to deal with this because I work full time and I work really long hours. And my wife and I have had these conversations. We're going to be having kids a little bit later in life just because of my career. And I was really afraid for a long time. And I'll tell you why. A big part of it was because you see all the time in the media, it's like, oh, he gets home from work and he thinks that's all he has to do. And in my head, I'm going, oh my gosh, yeah. After working a 12, 14-hour day, I really probably am not going to have the juice in me to do dishes, to do that much laundry. And yeah, it's going to kind of be necessary that someone else helps me with that. But a lot of men feel as though all of the above are expected of them. And I think they feel the weight, whether it's accurate or not, they certainly feel the weight of the world on their shoulders.
Absolutely. And of course, you can't hear this in the media because it's taboo. The reality is that women's work at home has actually declined. This just came out at Pew last week. The women's, because of course, convenience foods and technology and all of this has made it easier at home for women.
Right.
But the expectation for men is that the expectation for men is that they do more, but they don't work fewer hours than they did. So women work fewer hours than men. Mm-hmm. They have less housework at home. Men are not working fewer hours and are expected to pick up more at home. Mm. So it doesn't come out in the wash because ultimately the real problem is that you're trying to have two people working your hours that you just described, Stephen, two parents working your hours with little kids under 5. Forget about it. Mayhem, complete mayhem. And this study doesn't want to say that's the reason why your life is, there's no time in the day, bottom line. Well, it's not dad.
Well, I can give you sort of anecdotally. Right now, my wife has gone, my father-in-law, great man, I've talked about this on air, he had sepsis and he has to undergo the surgery right now. And so she's gone to help my mother-in-law. So she's gone for about a week and a half. And I'm able to do everything. You know, we have 2 dogs, do the laundry, do the dishes, make sure I take care of my own meals, also do this program. But it's difficult. And I certainly miss my wife. And one of the biggest arguments we got into in the last couple of weeks, and really when you look back at it, we were just kind of, wires were crossed. It was a good thing. And I think this is one of the most toxic lies from feminism as a man. One of the most toxic lies, using that word, I guess ironically you're toxic, is that men want to dominate women. Men want, women to submit in a way that is disrespectful. And the truth is, the big argument we got into, she was leaving not only for her father-in-law, but she has a bachelorette party coming up. She's been on the road quite a bit. And some of them were trips to help me. We have a cottage. We're finally actually getting on a small lake up north. And we kind of got into an argument. I said, well, you know what? Maybe kind of going forward, it'd be good if you could be around home a little more. You've been traveling a lot. And she got a little bit upset. And she said, well, I was doing this and I'm traveling and this is for you. And I said, yeah, but you know what? But what I really want is my wife. And that's because I love my wife and I want my wife around, and it hurts when she's gone a lot. And that's not just the convenience thing. And this idea that the anger comes from a place of wanting to dominate my wife, I think a lot of men inherently are hurt by it in the vilification.
I'm 51. I've never met a man who thinks like that, including my own father, was born in 1922. It's a big fat lie. They taught this to scare women and to make them think, once again, that they're being victims. And so that they're victims of men. The average husband, and I'll say husband here as opposed to just man, because there's a big difference. Yeah. When you marry, once you've made that choice, everybody changes. Women and men both change when they become husbands and wives, and then again when they become mothers and fathers. And a husband's mindset is to help and serve and work with his wife, not to hold her down in any way. I mean, not to say that you can't find somebody like that, but I have seriously yet to meet that person. That's how rare he is, in my opinion, today. Whether he was that way I even take issue with the fact that it was that dominant back in the day, because I don't think men are, that's not who they are. And so feminists are the last people in the world you want to take any advice or information from about men specifically, or marriage, or motherhood for that matter. That's not their area of expertise.
No, well, it was. Now, what about these women who would point out, and I think it might have been the Young Turks who said, well, clearly Suzanne is hypocritical because she's written X amount of books and she works and she's a professional, so she doesn't believe what she's saying because look at the, which is kind of a compliment to your catalog of work, but still, you're a horrible human being.
No, I'm happy to talk about that. I used to get asked that a lot. I must have clarified it a while because it's been a while since I've had to. So every decision I have ever made has been with the focus of my family at the center. And so marriage and motherhood was going to be it for me. It was always going to be it for me. I actually was married before, no kids, for 4 years in my 20s. And much of the reason why we divorced is because of this. Different priorities, different timelines and values and whatnot. But I saw that it wasn't going to work out with this value system that I had in the end. So, which is why it ended in the end. But I started making choices about this early on in college before anybody else was. I would talk about marriage in college, and I was probably the only one who did because they thought that was crazy. But no, if I'm looking at my life long term, I've got to make choices. So what did I choose for a profession? I became a teacher initially. That's what I did in my 20s. That was choice number one. Living in the Midwest instead of the East Coast, which is where I was choice number two, because it's much more doable to raise a family there and financially. And then I left teaching when I was pregnant with my first to go home and do tutoring. You can tutor from your home for a few extra bucks, right? And so that was my plan, and that's what I did. And then it was when I was home with her that I wrote my first book. I ended up stopping the tutoring, and I wrote this book. And I was able to do that around her schedule because I had one child. And then once the second one came along 3 years later, I was out of commission for the next 5 years because once you have two, you no longer have that nice little schedule.
Especially if one of them is nice, one of them is evil, as is my theory with the Olsen twins. I don't remember which one's evil, but I know one of them is. Yes,
mix around.
Well, my son wasn't evil, but he was a handful, and it was way harder with him. So he took up all my time, and that's probably why I didn't have a third. But at any rate, so I was able to work my work schedule around her sleeping and her naps early on. And then I was like incognito. And then when they were both back in kindergarten is when I picked up and wrote the next book. So and I've never named nannies, no daycare, nothing. My husband works full time, always has. He's the breadwinner. So yes, I make money. Yes, I have a career. And I'm not telling people you can't do that. Figure out a way to do that around your other priority, if that's going to be your priority. So I am actually living proof, not that I'm a hypocrite, but that it actually can be done if you're creative and resourceful and what have you.
And you seem like a pretty strong-willed woman. You seem like a woman with strong opinions. I think the left might imagine your husband is sort of a Cagney character coming home and giving you the old 1-2 holding your wrists because, there isn't beef stew in the pot. But what is your relationship like? And how does your husband handle, obviously, you being in the limelight?
Well, the short answer is he's extremely supportive because he believes in everything that we have the exact same value system. I mean, it's just... It could not be more identical.
It's almost as though that's important when picking a mate, as opposed to both liking the same movies or, Snapchat filters.
Every decision we've made has been with family first, even with his job choices. So that's what binds us unquestionably. So he supports everything that I do. As far as we definitely do have different personalities. But then there's parts of our personalities that are very similar. And so we did this a lot, which, by the way, was why I wrote my last book, The Alpha Female's Guide to Men and Marriage, because that is part memoir. And it sort of tells my story of inadvertently.
Send that book to my wife. Let me give you some things. Send that book to my wife and write a nice private note. Because, according to Black Garrett, you know this, my wife is no shrinking violet. And sometimes she'll come in, for example, she really helps with work sometimes. Like we're moving into a new space and she helps decorate. But every now and then she comes in and she'll overstep her bounds. Because she doesn't work for the company. She never has. She just comes in to help support me. And I have to look at her like, sweetie, this person is my manager. Stop it. Stop it. I'm not trying to dominate you. I just don't want you to this is overstepping boundaries.
Yeah, and it's all about turning it off, like being, understanding that there's a time and a place. And so if you happen to have a very strong personality, which I do, that has worked very well for me in the marketplace, unquestionably. It has not worked well for me in my marriage. So I finally, we had a come to Jesus party about this, I guess you could say. And we had to work out how both of us were doing this because we are both wanting to be heard, if you want to put it that way, and then marry that with masculinity and femininity and how that works best. So it's sort of a combination of personality analysis mixed with biological sex differences and how in a marriage things work best to make it really smooth and easy. And it took me, it's great now, but it took a long time because I had a mother who never did turn it off, and it was very bad. So that's...
And that's not even to speak of wives with penises. We'll put that on the shelf right now because that's a whole different can of penises. Let me ask you this. So if you were to give one final word of advice, right? You have young men and women in college right now. What is it that a man should do in order to make himself more attractive, not only more attractive, but a more capable and a loving husband, to make himself more valuable, I should say, to a future wife, mate? And what is it that a woman could do to make herself most valuable so that they both find what they're looking for?
That's a great question. So I would take men in a room separately from women, for sure, and tell them, I'm a big believer in single-sex education.
I can hear the comment section now, but yes, continue. I'm talking. My least popular view is I think that you should have to sign. I think it should be the exception rather than the rule for men and women to train at the gym together. And I'll tell you why. I think there are probably more affairs between women and men and personal trainers than any other facet of the workplace. I watched a woman doing the open and close machine and a guy right down like 1, 2, counting all the way up to 23. I'm like, first off, why'd you choose 23 reps? No one needs to do 23 reps of that. Second, I was hoping that a husband would walk in and kick his ass. All right, let me go back to the question. So men, separate, single room.
Okay, I would tell men that this is going to be really difficult because all they've heard their whole lives, especially if they're in college now, because they're not very old and been around very long, but all they've heard is that women, essentially my argument is that women have said, we want to rule the world, basically. We want everything to be different than the way that it was 50 years ago. So we're going to supplant the male role, or at least join you. And the men heard that as like, okay, well, men are not meant to fight with women. They do not want to fight with you. They want to love you. They want to serve you. They want to take care of you. And you basically said you want to do what they do. And so they have, in my opinion, lowered their aspirations to make room for the women. And because women are so aggressive now, it's sort of a mess because men don't know how to behave, if you will. What's happened is they've softened, and the women aren't liking that. But the reason why the men have softened is because basically they thought that's what women wanted, because they thought women wanted to be like the men. So what are the men going to have to do? You can't both be that way. So they took a step back. Women aren't happy with them because they don't want soft men. Mm-hmm. And men are afraid to be aggressive because the culture tells them that's terrible. They're toxic.
So to distill it down, you're looking young, okay. I don't know, young apple, young ahi tuna, whatever the hell the names are for celebrity boys at this point.
I would say
go ahead.
Don't be afraid to assert yourself. You need to still, find your way in life, find what you want to do, irrespective of what the women around you do. Just find what you love, find a path that works for you, and don't be afraid to go after it and not pay attention to how that affects the women around you. And don't be afraid to be assertive with them or in general, despite the fact that you're being told that you're sexually harassing them. Now, that's not to say that they should, you really do have to be careful today. So I'm not.
No one here is advocating sexual harassment. If you already have a preset vinyl casting couch with a peel-off cover, that means you're probably going the wrong direction. Okay, so that's okay. We don't need to get into that. I'm not wading into that quagmire. Now, single-sex, female locker room, penises notwithstanding, the advice to young women to make, for them to make themselves as valued and as fulfilled in their life. What advice would you give?
Number one, what is important to you now is very likely not going to be important to you 10 years from now. Know that in advance. As you get older, a family is going to become your focus. So whatever this career is that you're building now, keep it in perspective. Most people do not have careers anyway. They have jobs. And even the ones that do have careers, like you've described yours, it's all in. It's like 13, 14, 15 hours a day. That is your life. So you don't have any other life. And while you're building it, that's all fine and dandy. But just know that once you have children, that's not going to work. So you're going to have to start planning now by putting your work in perspective of your personal life and marriage and motherhood, if that indeed is your goal. So that's a professional opinion that I would give. Mm-hmm. As far as the love side, clearly I have a lot of negative things to say about casual sex and the hookup culture, which I think is horribly destructive. Mm-hmm. So what I want to do and what I want to tell them, what I plan to tell them is it's time to date again. You need to learn how to have actual relationships with men without your phones and actual going out on a date. And that means letting him call you or ask you out and have actual date. He pays for it. I mean, I actually have a list of this in the book that's coming out that's going to seem so retro for young people today. And yet it's such
and anger a lot of hipsters. Like, this isn't ironically retro. It's just retro.
Oh, it's going to be interesting. And yet fast forward 10 years down the road and they're going to want that man to have the competency and the confidence to take charge of his life and be a leader. Yeah. And you're not setting them up that way because you're trying to lead instead.
You know what? This is going to sound, trust me, there's a segue here. It's for this reason I don't wear hoodies. Now, I used to wear hoodies a lot because I was often, with work, I was coming from the gym, and so I would often have a hooded sweater on. And I know Quarter Black Hair doesn't like this because he wears
personally
hoodies.
Attacked.
A lot of people think it was the turning point was Trayvon and Zimmerman. No, but that did help. But I realized that as a man, I was going, hold on a second. No grown men who I respect wear like hoodies to work. And I said, any instance where there's a hoodie, I could just wear a non-hooded sweater and just look a little bit more like my father. And it really was a conscious decision because I felt like I was dressed in a boy band.
I'm actually glad you brought up clothing because I think it's been a huge letdown for women to stop wearing dresses and men to stop wearing suits. I think the automatic respect that came from that attire, you didn't even have to earn it. You just walked in the room. I mean, right now when my husband puts on a suit, I immediately feel differently about him. I just do than if he's wearing his slob clothes. And he does with me. When I have if I put a dress on instead of pants, it is like a magnet. There's something about the skirt. I mean, the skirt. It's the skirt. It's all about the skirt.
It's true. It's the skirt. It's also, when I wear a tuxedo with the suspenders and I untie the bow tie, I know it's going to be a red panty night. No, red panty night just means dressed. It means it's gonna be a good night. That's what it means. Oh, this is a term that has been used in our house. So also Conor McGregor. But yes, it is like a magnet. That being said, we could say we could agree that's a little bit societal because when we could go back further to men in tights, are dressed like William Shakespeare, and most women would say that's silly. So that does change.
That's true, but I would challenge anybody to put on a suit and a skirt and go out on a date and see if they don't feel differently about each other and look at each other different and have a more sexual attraction and just the whole 9 yards. I just think right now. I think there's a reason that those period pieces, Downton Abbey and whatnot, are so amazing. If that was so awful because it's so retro, why on earth is it so popular? Why are women specifically, by the way, not men, women glued to those programs? Yeah. What are they seeing? They're seeing something they don't have that they want. It's very obvious.
Mad Men would be another example of that. I mean, this is Don Draper's a philandering jerk, but women are like, yeah, I know, but he's so sexy. It's the suits and the chiseled jawline, let's be honest. That's something you can't teach, unfortunately. Okay, all right, that is Suzanne Venker. Damn it, I know because you told me it's not Venkman. Venker. I just said Venkman, didn't I? It's the Ghostbusters thing. I was saying, don't say Susan, say Suzanne. Don't say Venkman, say Venker. Suzanne.
Thank you.
Venker.com. The Twitter is Suzanne Venker. Hey, Suzanne, I really appreciate you taking the time. I know we've gone overtime, and I hope to have you back when this book is out. Hey there, here I am drinking from my mug in a button-down. How often do you see this? Never. So do me a favor and yourself, click one of these videos playing one of these boxes here, or subscribe, hit the notification bell also, because subscriptions don't really mean a whole lot. If you really want to support the show, join my club. If you don't, then there's no helping you.